intelligencesquared.com.
We are debating our motion, the war on terror was the right response to 9/11, and arguing for the motion, we now have Colleen Graffy, who was an Assistant Secretary of State in the US State Department in George W. Bush's second term, and she has special responsibility for public diplomacy in Europe and Eurasia, an ardent supporter of the Bush administration's policies. Colleen Graffy, your time starts when you get to the podium.
The war on terror was the right response to 9/11. Those opposed to this motion will likely have two strands to their argument. The first concerns the rhetoric. How can you go to war against a tactic, they will say. The second concerns the method. The argument is that law enforcement, not military power, should have been the response to 9/11. First, for the rhetoricians in the group. Well, I'm sorry, but there is no UN committee on naming wars. It just happens. We had World War I, then World War II, a bit unimaginative. Then we had the Cold War. How can you go to war against temperature? Well, let's remember that shortly after 9/11, before both houses of Congress and 82 million people via television, President Bush explained that the war on terror was against al-Qaeda and a radical network of terrorists with global reach, as well as their governments that supported them. That is, war on terror is shorthand for al-Qaeda and their associates and the governments that support them. I think newspaper editors around the world are grateful for the shortened version. But I understand now it's going to be called the Overseas Contingency Operation. That's better? Now, many point to America's war on drugs as evidence that the war on terror is all just hyperbole. But actually, it's evidence of just the opposite. In the 1980s, the US government declared a war on drugs for the specific purpose of extending the jurisdictional lines from the Drug Enforcement Administration to including the Department of Defense. The government reasoned that in order to have an effective counter-narcotic strategy, they needed to address not only the problem of internal drug demand, but also the external global supply of drugs that were flooding into the country and which could only be addressed by tapping into military capabilities. The same was intended by the US government after 9/11. The jurisdictional lines needed to be extended because the Department of Justice and law enforcement measures alone were not enough to tackle the threat of global terrorism. Which brings me to the second criticism, that policing, not military might, should have been the response to 9/11. The problem with that argument is that law enforcement has been tried and it failed. Prior to 9/11, many had viewed terrorism mainly as a crime to be prosecuted. This is the approach we took in 1993 after the bombing of the World Trade Center. Post 9/11, it was clear that the attacks on US embassies in East Africa, on the USS Cole, and other atrocities, as General Musharraf has described, were more than isolated crimes, and that law enforcement against these external threats would not and could not be an effective tool. Let's face it, to suicidal men commandeering passenger planes to slam into building, the threat of prosecution is just not going to be persuasive. Did we seriously think that some CSI Kandahar was going to be able to deal with the 10,000 terrorists that Osama bin Laden had trained in Afghanistan between 1996 and 2001? Military capabilities were needed. Secondly, the problem with a law enforcement approach is that you are restricted to law enforcement only, whereas a war footing allows necessary military capabilities as well as law enforcement. as well as diplomacy, as well as aid, as well as humanitarian efforts. As General Musharraf has said, the socioeconomic and political factors are equally important, but you can't build a school or hospital without security, and only a military can provide that. Military capacity allows for a full range of responses for when law enforcement alone is not enough. And let's remember, it was, 3 days into the recent UK riots when people were starting to ask, where is the military? The fact is, the military approach has worked. In the decades since 9/11, al-Qaeda's actions have not kept pace with their aspirations. Coordinated attacks of a global reach have fallen, and we are working so that it remains so. We learned from recently recovered documents that Osama bin Laden was lamenting from his bunker that the drone strikes were preventing training and reducing capable leadership. The fact that war was the right response to 9/11 is reinforced by the fact that the Obama administration, after great scrutiny and great deliberation, has actually continued on the same course. In fact, he's increased drone strikes. My final point is that nothing short of war was needed to get at the root causes of terrorism. And the root causes of terrorism are the Middle East dictators and tyrants who suck the air out of public discourse and prevent the development of civil society. This leaves only mosques as the place for people to vent. Unfortunately, it is also the place where people are radicalized into a perverted version of Islam which hopes to replace one tyranny with another, their own. For 60 years, the United States' desire for stability was more important than pushing for democratic reforms in the Middle East. The war on terror led to a significant and strategic change in the U.S. foreign policy, one that allowed for America's vital interests and deepest beliefs to become one. It led to the Freedom Agenda, which was committed to supporting the democratic aspirations of all people. Nothing short of war would have changed the power structures in Afghanistan and Iraq. And make no mistake, the change was a catalyst for what we see today, the Arab Spring and the crumbling of tyrants from Tunisia to Egypt, Libya, and hopefully more to come. Don't take it from me. Listen to a voice from the region. Lebanese political leader Walid Shamblat, during Lebanon's 2005 Cedar Revolution, said, "It's strange for me to say it, but this progress of change has started because of the American invasion of Iraq. I was cynical about Iraq, but when I saw the Iraqi people voting 3 weeks ago, 8 million of them, it was the start of a new Arab world. The Syrian people, the Egyptian people, all say that something is changing. The Berlin Wall has fallen. We can see it." To our Western eyes, Afghanistan and Iraq alternate between depressing and discouraging with glimmers of hope in between. But to those in the Middle East who have only lived under tyrants and thought that this was the way it was and always would be, seeing the end of Saddam Hussein was the first crack in the edifice. With the end of his regime, a man who represented the ultimate symbol of despotic rule in the region, came the prospect that other regimes, other Saddams, may also fall. The Cold War, the war on terror, the overseas contingency operation, the name is secondary to the nature of what each represents, a commitment to overturning tyranny and the freeing of the human spirit. The war on terror was the right response to 9/11.